This was a fun picture. It took about an hour to set up. Get to the top of the chair and look, and a couple of the pieces would be overlapping. That wasn't quite right. It would be a shadow in the wrong place. Took the picture, and it had nothing in the middle. It looked a little empty. So then we put a bugle in the center, and all of a sudden it brought it together. So it's kind of an art shot showing you a lot of different sabers we're going to be talking about this evening. So this is a history, or as I say, here's some notes on. I don't claim to know all the information about these, but I've been playing around with this topic and studying it for a number of years. U.S. Cavalry sabers. We're going to talk about Revolutionary War through World War I, and the World War I sabers were last used in 1934, when the Army said no more swords, except officers carry them for dress occasions. So we're going to look at this kind of four parts. The first one being the parts of the sword, so you have some of the nomenclature, so it'll be familiar when I mention it. And then we're going to talk about enlisted and non-com officer swords. And then we're going to talk about practice sabers. You don't want to have young recruits practicing with sharp swords. You have wooden swords here. And then we'll talk about some of the differences that officer sabers have compared to the others. Not going to work at all, apparently. He's right. If this was a stone tool, I'd have it working. Okay, well, Cascadia found the most important tool for tonight. I've highlighted in yellow some of the terms that are more important for our discussion right now. I don't expect you to memorize these, but if you see them once and I say it again, maybe some of these will fall into place. Many of you will call that the blade. That makes sense, the blade of the sword. And this portion is the hilt. And where you grab it, the grip, the grips. The very end of that is the pommel. The part that protects your hand is sometimes called the knuckle bowl or the guard. And you have a little flat spot here on many swords at the base, the ricasso. That's frequently where you'll find marks. The marks could be the maker, it can be the date, it can be inspector marks, it could be a U.S. surcharge, a U.S. stamp into it. And you have the fuller or the groove that appears on some swords. On the scabbard, you have the throat and the tip or the drag. The drag is important because there are examples of swords that have been used so much that the drag is ground all the way to the scabbard itself, making a hole there so the water can leak out if it gets wet. That represents a lot of use to grind away that much steel on a piece. So right here we have some examples of 18th century, meaning the 1700s, 18th century. We start on top, and most of these pieces are here, so you want to come up and take a closer look later on. This is a blacksmith-made saber from the American Revolution. Many people were afraid to put their names on pieces during the Revolutionary War, because if the British found out, they'd be in trouble. There are some examples of American makers for weapons that would sign them, but that's kind of the exception. Now this could have been a blacksmith that was told, make up 50 swords for this local group. And the swords might have looked more or less like this. But it's hard to find two blacksmith-made Revolutionary War sabers that look the same. Everyone's got their own idea what a sword should look like. One of the things that's important here is it's a relatively straight blade until you get to the end, and then there's a swoosh where it curves up. That is a trait very common on Revolutionary War sabers. Now, if you look at it carefully, the blade doesn't have the groove in it, and it's blacksmith-made, so it's not perfectly straight. Back in this time period, they sharpened the edges. Later on, they didn't. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And it has a wooden grip that's wrapped in leather, and that's the leather I talked about before, which is very fragile. Underneath that is an example from, about 1795 to 1810. It's called a pillow pommel, based upon the shape of the pommel. That's an English piece that's been copied. You'll find that many of the swords we're looking at tonight that are American sabers were copied off of English, French, or what would become Germany, or something from Bavaria. Not a lot of independent invention, although we do have a few in the sequence. have an example of a hussar style saber. These have a Germanic ancestry, but then you see them showing up in France and Germany as well. This has a fairly big handle. The handle actually is bigger than a hand, which is unusual. Usually these things are kind of small and hard to grip by modern people. It does have a fuller groove in there. This sword is the 1798 Star Contract Saber. Most books say this is the first U.S. contract saber after the Revolutionary War. They contracted for 2,000 of these, and there's probably a few dozen that have survived. There's a little point right here in the pommel that makes it almost look like a bird beak. Later on, we'll look at eagle pommel swords. They were doing bird heads on pommels sometimes. It kind of resembles that, but actually there's a function to that, that if somebody else was swinging their saber and it hit the knuckle blower of the guard and it slid, it would get stuck in that little piece there, so it wouldn't slide back and get you in the arm. So it had a functional reason. Also, you'll see, and going next slide, sabers for horsemen, be you cavalry or dragoon or what, they tend to be long. If you have a short sword and you're on a horse, you can't reach people. Look at that, reach out and touch someone. The old telecommunication ad. You know, I'll use Lyle here as an example. I need to have a sword with a blade, and on average it's 32 to 34 inches long. Now early on I said these were sharp. There's a problem with that though, because a sharp sword with enough energy can stick into a target, be it a human or a tree. These swords, when you're on horseback, you don't want to drop it. You had actually a sword knot. You had a strap that went around your wrist. It was tied to the sword. So if you lost a grip, it would dangle, but you wouldn't lose your weapon. Now let's say, once again, sorry, Lyle, we swing. He's an infantryman, and I want to take him out. You know, I want to damage his shoulder. I swing real hard, and I stick right in the bone. My horse keeps moving. And the sword's attached, so I get pulled off my horse. So later on, they went to having swords that were sharpened. And because I just don't want him to, I don't want to kill him, I just want him to shoot at me. If I can hit him hard enough in the shoulder, I can take him out for a few weeks. So he's no longer an active soldier. And here is the 1798 Star. They all were delivered in 1799, thus that's the date. There's the U.S. mark in the 1799, and there's the N Star Company. As I said, first contract, 200 sabers. And this scabbard has a little stud on the end. There would be a strap that would go over the shoulder. There'd be a little place for that to attach onto, as opposed to having rings, which you'll see most of the swords later have rings, and they would be suspended from straps on a sword belt. This was a separate belt going over the shoulder. Next slide, please. So here we see once again the Star, the 1798 Star, which has its roots going back into the Revolutionary War, that style. And then you see the next contract by the government was for the 1807 Rose. So after a while, you just kind of run low on swords, you got to do another order. The standing army for the United States was very small between wars back in that period of time. However, there were state militia. In 1808, the State Militia Act said that the federal government had to supply the state troops with weapons and, if necessary, uniforms and accoutrements so they could be ready. So the idea is that the militia or the National Guard, they're in standby. And the standing army is small. At the time of Lewis and Clark, there were like 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers in the Army of the United States. But you had lots of other folks out there. So there's an example. And at this point now, Rose becomes a major manufacturer, but Star, starting in 1798, actually becomes probably the premier manufacturer, getting the most contracts, producing the most swords for the Army until the early 1830s, when another company, the Ames Company, comes into play. Next slide, please. And then you see these swords, this style of sword, they're nicknamed the Ugly Ducklings. Not very attractive. It's copied off of German and British sabers. Just a functional sword. And we go from where it used to be called a D guard, shaped like a D, now it's a P shape, so they call it a P guard. That's straight a little bit later. You also look at the width of the blades. The blades are wide early on, blades get narrower through time. And here you can can see, kind of hard to read it, but there's the manufacturer's name there, William W.H. Rose. And there's 500 of these were contracted for.
Wow.
Next slide, please. And Star just had big contracts making them this is their 1812-13 model. I think they had 11,000 of these ordered by the government, and this is the 1818 model, of which there were about 10,000 more or so. So now they're getting the larger contracts. In 1818, actually, almost all of these were really purchased for the states. The government bought them, and then they handed them off to the state militia groups. And one way you can tell the difference, this one has a bent guard on it here, since the shape is not quite there. But this has these bands to help support the area where the rings are at, to attach onto the straps. This one does not have the bands. This has a flat blade. This has the fuller in the blade. So little traits that you can tell. And there's an example of one of the 1818 sabers with stamping on it. U.S., U.S. government, P for proofed, LS, that's the inspector, Luther Sage. He inspected half of these swords, and then N star underneath, the manufacturer. Next slide, please. Then you get into something which is much more familiar. If you've watched any Western movies or Civil War movies, you're seeing things that have the two branches in addition to the rest of the guard. The first example of this is copied off of a 1822 British saber, and the idea there was to make it more lightweight. So it doesn't have as much curve to it, and the blade is pretty thin. To strengthen the blade, they actually have called a quill back. They have a big, fat, circular back to it to try to make it stronger. And the scabbards are really thin, about as thin as you can make iron. You can take a scabbard and bend it. You can take the saber and easily snap it. So reports came in from the field that these are no good. They were first produced 1832, and they were replaced in 1840 by the next model. With those scabbards being that thin and weak, if you have one horse that then pushes up against a tree or another horse, that's enough energy to squish that scabbard so you can't get the sword out. So it really was, it went for a lighter weight sword, thinking it would be easier to use, but it wasn't strong enough, it wasn't functional. A little trial and error. So then they copied a French 1822 model saber, which is a very heavyweight sword. It's got a square back, it's got a bigger blade, the whole thing is stronger, the scabbard, big and heavy. This developed the nickname in the United States Army as the old wrist breaker. This sword, they overdid it. 3 bears, right? One was too cold, too hot, just right. This is what we're kind of seeing where they're experimenting, and they used this sword until 1858, when then, this is the beginning of the Ames Company material here, then the Ames Company came up with what they called the light cavalry saber. Not to confuse with Star Wars. That's a lightsaber. It's different. Collectors will call this the model 1860, however they did start making them in 1858. And that was the one just right, the one that was in between. And this particular sword, they then continued to use until about 1905. They ran low, and then they did another order for more swords. They stopped making them after the Civil War because they had so many in surplus, they didn't need more swords. So the Civil War swords were issued over and over again. We actually have one in the collection that was issued as a new sword in about 1890, and yet been issued. Now the Ames Company, they've got their first discussion for a contract in 1832 to make swords, and one of those discussions is to make officers' swords. They wanted to have 500 swords made at that time, the government said. And so they write the contract, Ames starts making these swords, and then the government says, actually we changed our mind, we're not going to pay you for these swords. You have to sell them to individual officers. Think of the logistics behind that. Well, when you're no longer required to buy your sword, through the army, then you could buy your sword from somebody else. Which meant some European manufacturers said, well, we can make swords that look just like that, almost. And we can sell them for less money. And so people then started buying the right model of sword, but it was a cheaper quality European sword. The bad part was that Ames had to fix anything that broke on the European swords. This almost killed the largest sword company in United States military history. The Ames Company had the most contracts, produced the most swords, and they almost got killed off with their first contract. Because it was very difficult to get people to buy specifically from Ames, and then they had to pay to fix other people's broken swords. So here we have their sequence, the 1833, the 1840, and the light cavalry saber. Next slide, please. Once again, this is what you see in the movies and whatnot. The 1833 Dragoon saber actually has something that's etched in by hand on the blades. Most enlisted men's swords have no decoration on the blades. So here's one of the exceptions. Early ones said United States Dragoons, because at that point in time there was no cavalry, they were called the Dragoons. And later examples of this saber say United States, that is hand scratched into there. If you're an officer's sword, it would be much fancier. This is the enlistment's version. And you can kind of see this rounded back that's on there. And we can look at it later on if you want to take a closer look. Next slide, please. Here's an example. Threw some photos in here to give you some context. Here's your typical Civil War soldier, cavalry soldier, fully outfitted. Kind of proudly showing off his equipment there. There is the sword. And here's his saber belt. There's a strap that goes over the shoulder to support some of the weight. He's got a Colt pistol stuck in there, and you got something else over here. All kinds of equipment. A cavalry soldier would be issued a sword, a carbine, which is a short rifle, and a pistol. Those were the weapons that they had. A lot of times the swords really weren't used, they weren't functional. And one of the challenges is that they're noisy. Here's your standard Civil War saber. Now put that on a horse and have a small group of 20 people going around. A lot of times they left these in camp. Now what they did, because this should make even more noise, the blade should rattle more, but they actually would find a door and they'd slam it in the door. They would dent in the scabbards, tighten them up just enough that the blade itself wouldn't rattle. But still you got these rings and whatnot. So a lot of times they left them back at camp. And this one also is getting to where they're not sharpened anymore. So that's like a butter knife. But if you hit Lyle on the shoulder with it while riding by on a horse, he would say, ouch. You picked the wrong seat. You picked the wrong seat. Next slide, please. And here's a picture from Fort Walla Walla. This is about an 1890 photo. And once again, Foley and gear. We have two of these pictures. At first, I thought they were the same picture. We got this one, and the other one was available. We got this one, I thought it was the same one. I go, well, okay, having a duplicate's not the end of the world, but actually, they're buddies. Same pose. I mean, put them side by side, you go, okay, yeah, they're different guys that went and had their picture taken at the same time. This photographer's mark here, Crawford, is interesting. Crawford had a little bit of space on Fort Walla Walla. He was a sergeant, and they gave him space for a little photo studio on the grounds. We also know that somebody that repaired shoes and boots was given some space in a building to do their on-the-side business. So a soldier could go to this other soldier and say, I want my picture taken, and give him, a buck or whatever to have it done. Now, the earlier pictures that are on sheets of iron, sometimes called tin types, those are a one-off. Where this right here, this is now done with a negative, and there's a separate piece of photo paper which is stuck onto the card stock. So a photographer would buy a bunch of the cards, and then when you take the photos, take the paper, then he would glue them on. And so here you can see Crawford, and you see Fort Walla Walla on there. Next slide, please. And here we have another example, also from the 1890s, from Fort Walla Walla, courtesy of my friend, Pete. This is a very unusual photo. This is an Indian soldier. You've probably all heard about Indian scouts. Native Americans made very effective scouts. And in the early 1890s, the government said, some of our best fighting men are these Indian scouts. What if an entire troop was all Indian folks? Wouldn't that be the greatest fighting force? And so they designated Troop L of every cavalry regiment. And they created a couple of these. One of them, the experiments was here at Fort Walla Walla. This is not an Indian scout, this is actually an Indian soldier. And he's got his dress uniform on. There's his helmet, kind of like the helmet behind me here. And the same sword again. That's an unusual photo, and Pete has a note on the back of it that if anything happens to him, it's supposed to come to the museum, and he's told his wife it's supposed to come here. So eventually we'll see this gem. Next. And here we have this once again showing up. This one sword, as I told you before, was used for a very long time. This is from our exhibit, circa 1903, 9th Cavalry, African-American soldier with the same sword. Next slide. Now, I mentioned that they kept using the Civil War swords. This is the one I picked up and showed you. There's, you see the debt. They kept using the Civil War swords until they eventually ran out. And then in 1904, 1905, they did a new contract. Have some more made. Went back to the Ames Company again to make the swords. Now, there's a couple of differences that should stand out. You should notice that the rings, the mounting rings, are now much closer together on the 0405 model. And what's harder to see is that the guard area here is now done in steel as opposed to brass. They had some problems with the machinery and ended up making them out of steel, even though they weren't asked to be made out of steel. They were anticipating a brass, but it's stronger, it's more brittle, more apt to crack. But that's the difference. Otherwise, everything else is the same. So they did them order for, I forget the number, it was a lot. 10,000, 11,000 new swords, and 3,000 extra scabbards. So they could use the scabbards with the old swords. We talked about the difference in the spacing here. Well, that dictates how the sword will hang from your straps. When the rings are closer together, the sword's not going to be angled down as much, so it's not as apt to drag on the ground. I did mention that some of these, you can see right there, a little bit of a facet on this one. It should be rounded off, a little bit of a facet. That sword was probably during the Civil War, was carried around and used enough that when they were dismounted and walking, it was dragging on the ground and it ground away that steel. Next slide, please. Now here's an example of a fully American-made piece. Now the last one we looked at was again copied off of a French saber, the one we used for many, many years. And then we said, oh, let's see what we can do. The problem with the military is they assigned a committee to do this, and everybody on the committee got to name a trait they wanted to see on their sword. They weren't working together. They all got one piece of that and made something that did not work. They made about 1,039 of these and sent them into the field, and they got horrible reviews. It's got a skinnier blade with a little bit of curvature to it. Unlike the earlier swords that had a leather wrap around the grip with some wire holding it in place, now they're using what they call fish skin, which is actually shark skin, typically seen on officer swords. And then here on the scabbard, it's wrapped in pig hide, so it's not as shiny and it's quieter. In 1902, the Army starts coming out with olive drab green uniforms as opposed to the earlier stuff. It now need to hide a little bit better. And instead of the buttons being shiny brass, they have a bronze coating on them. And a lot of the equipment starts getting toned down, and this is another example of how that's playing out. Now we see here's an example of one of the books for practicing. Now we're going to talk about practice a little bit with this. And this is that experimental 1904, 1905 saber. It's reprinted in 1908, but they're showing you this is how you're supposed to use the sword. And this will be different. The next thing that we see, there are changes. These are kind of similar to what they've been doing all along, little tweaks in the fighting style. And then George Patton, who later becomes a very famous general in World War II, he comes up with a new model of sword. Next, please. And here it is, the model 1913 U.S. saber, sometimes called the Patton saber. He had studied fencing over in Europe. He liked what the English and the French were doing. Instead of having a sword that you're swinging, you're having a sword that is designed for thrusting. It's right in front of me, but I'm not seeing it.
I think it's behind you.
Oh, it ended up over here. It's over here with the enlisted sabers. So see, it's got a long blade. This is actually sharp, and the key thing is the point. This is designed, you do several different moves to get the person vulnerable, and it's designed for one thing, one thrust. So it's got a very pointed, narrow blade for deep penetration.
Isn't that kind of based off of the German sword, the Schlager?
I think to some extent, but it's something that was common with the French and the British at that time. See, a lot of protection for the hand on this. And here, once again, the scabbard is not shiny and noisy. Now it's wrapped in canvas. The first year that they made these, they actually had a little projection on the end of the scabbards. Every man was issued half of a tent shelter. And these were supposed to be the poles for both ends of the tent. But that meant that your scabbard was on wet ground. Wet dirt is really bad for metal. It makes things rust. So after about a year, they said, well, that was a great idea on how to save carrying. Usually be a two-piece that would screw together a tent pole. They go, oh, no, that's not going to work. And they stopped doing that. Next slide, please. Now you can see here, we're seeing that on horseback, once again, it's about that thrust. And if you're on foot, there's also the strategy. You move this way, then that way, and get the person vulnerable, and then you make that one lunge. So it's a different type of fighting. And some of you know that Patton did pretty well in the 1912 Olympics. He placed 5th in the modern pentathlon. And apparently in one event, he kind of got messed up in his scoring. He should have got scored higher, and he probably would have medaled. But he did really well in the fencing and represented us well, and ended up becoming famous for this well before World War II. Next slide, please. Practicing. A few people have commented here walking in. What about these wooden swords? They wouldn't hurt much. Well, it's smack. But you don't practice with deadly weapons when you have raw recruits. You have practice sabers made from wood. There's protection for the hand. Wooden blade. You have flat blades. Sometimes there's round blades. This one right here we know goes with the Patton saber. This is a model 1913 practice saber. The Patton saber is designed for the thrust. So you're actually holding it with your thumb like that as opposed to a grip like this. You're holding the Patton saber like this for the thrust. And this has the same thumb groove right up top here. It's designed so that you can use it the same way as the saber. And you can have a piece of metal protecting your hand. You can have a piece of leather. Or you can have a piece of, or a basket, a wicker basket. Now this basket is very old and very brittle, it's very dry. So if you look at it funny, it's liable to crack. But when wicker is fresh and new, it's pretty flexible. And it's a good way to protect your hand. When they produce these, they'd always send extra blades because the blades would get broken. Now, this particular blade was never used. It's still got all the varnish on it, and it's marked RIA, Rock Island Arsenal. That's where a lot of military equipment was made, and then 1913, the year that this was produced. Okay, and then we also have other protective gear. Where that, on your head, there would be a big piece to protect your chest, and then you'd have gauntlets. I thought I had the gauntlets, or maybe they're still back in the room. Well-padded gauntlets, so if they get hit real hard, you really don't feel it because it's leather with a lot of padding. Next slide, please. Now, officer swords. Officers frequently had something that was very similar to the enlisted men, but was fancier. But then sometimes there were different styles, also for officer swords. And officer swords came in different levels of being fancy. If you didn't have a whole lot of money, you might buy the basic sword. And let's say that cost $8.50 back in 1862. If you had a little more money, or maybe mom and dad wanted you to look good, maybe you'd buy the $12 sword, or maybe the $15, or the $18, or the $25 sword. You had swords with jewels on them. You had swords with real gold. When Congress would make a sword to present to like a major general like Grant at the end of the war, they'd spend like $2,500 on a sword, which would be made from scratch by Tiffany or somebody like that. So you see different levels of decoration. Here, if you just look at this part of the sword, you see this is all plain. I think there's a line down there. And this has got some decoration on it, and this is really fancy. There's 3 different steps as far as the cost. And these are not necessarily cavalry officer swords, although cavalry officers could have used those. The cavalry officers in this period were using a sword very similar to the others, except it was fancy. So it's got that same 2 extra branches on the guard. And very ornate, and instead of being a plain blade, if you can see it, we'll see pictures later. Fancy. They call it engraving. Actually, it's typically rolled on with high pressure. Sometimes it's etched in place. Sometimes there's things engraved. Engraving is done by hand. That required more skill, and that was more expensive. You get stuff that would have hand work on it. Next slide, please. We talked early on about bird heads. Seeing some examples of that. Actually, even before the Revolutionary War. You see bird heads, you see horse heads, you see dogs sometimes. But birds were very common. The eagle was the thing you see most often. Eagle pommels work really well with American officers, as the eagle being our national bird. It makes sense. This screaming eagle, this proud eagle. However, just because it has an eagle head doesn't make it an American sword. You have to have either an American maker or an American retailer stamped into the blade, or the blade itself has to have decorations that are American motifs. Sometimes it's a U.S., sometimes it's an eagle. Next slide, please. So you can see an example here of an officer with this is kind of a later style of eagle pommel, probably 1845 to 55. It does have I can see enough of the buckle there. That's the standard buckle. It has eagle in the middle and a silver wreath. That's the model 1851 sword belt buckle. So we know it's after that. The uniform is probably comparable with that. So, but this is on a paper carte de vista photo, and those start right before the Civil War, so that kind of dates this picture. You got to be careful though, because they can take their camera in 1861 and they can shoot a picture of an old picture and make a duplicate of it. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a rather ornate sword that would have been used in the War of 1812. It's got the eagle, it's got the D guard shape, it's got 5 balls. That's something that's a stylistic trait that's often seen. And here this langet, it's called, actually has an eagle with stars above it right on there. Langets are not common on American swords. A few manufacturers did that. In this case, this is an English-made sword for the American market. It's got the eagle with the shield. If you got an eagle with a shield on it, that's American piece. And here we got, I like to call this frog-legged eagle. You see it in the 1790s up into the 1810 period, where the legs are kind of out like chicken legs or frog legs. Early federal style eagle from the federal period after the Revolutionary War. And it's made by Solomon Jackson in England. And here's some examples compared to the plain blades that we saw with the earlier enlisted swords. Here's examples of what we see on some officer swords. Now, once again, there's that eagle we just saw. This is a scabbard with an eagle on top of a shield. Very much an American motif. This is a very ornate U.S. At first I looked at it and I go, is that an N? This particular manufacturer liked to do really fancy U.S.'s. I don't know if that's Payne even has a name. And then you have another one here. It's kind of got a cloud-like bubbly thing for the serifs. And that's a blade, and that's a blade. This is a scabbard. Next slide, please. And there we can see the one where it was kind of cloud-like. Now they would, the high points would be polished, they'd be shiny, and the back parts probably an acid wash would be dulled, and sometimes they also are blued. There's a process to the metal where you're bluing it, which keeps things from rusting and also makes it look pretty. When a sword has not been used and cleaned very much, you'll still see the shine and the bluing. And sometimes there'll be gilt or gold. The gold wash will be put on the blades. Now, that doesn't last all that long if the sword is cleaned a lot of times. Next slide, please. And here's an example for the 1833 Dragoon Saber. That's the one that had the quill back. I said that the blades were easy to break and the scabbards could bend easily. Well, the officer's version of that, which they only made a handful because there weren't that many officers or dragoons, they had portrait of Tecumseh. Tecumseh is a famous Indian chief, I think it was Shawnee, back in the War of 1812. He's very famous from that period of time, and they actually placed him on some of the swords to honor him. And he's got the tomahawk there and his bow and some arrows in his other hand. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the model 1840. That's the one that I picked up earlier. A very heavyweight sword. This particular manufacturer, Sabers, I've talked to a number of different people. They said they've never seen two officers' swords that are identical to this manufacturer. They made it a challenge to have each one be an individual piece. One person I know that had a dozen of them that were all different. And there's different levels of fancy. This one here has nice engraving there. This is the upper part. There's the throat. And because they had their hand carrying that there, they actually wore away much of the metal so that the engraving is hard to see. This particular manufacturer used a higher copper content in their brass, meaning it was a softer metal so it wore more easily. Next slide, please. And here's an example. There's some embellishment there, and there's extra stuff cast into the brass. That shows you that is an officer's saber. The enlisted one just had plain with no design. And once again, there's a little better picture of the 1851 buckle. We have an example over here if you want to see it. Next slide, please. Here is a rather fancy saber. By this point in time, it's really not meant to fight with. Officers could have fancy swords and they could have plain swords. A plain sword would be for everyday use or when they go into battle. They'd have a fancier sword if they could afford multiple swords for dress occasions or if they're going to a dance or some formal thing. This is an example of a later sword where it's got all the components. I don't actually know if this is size for me, very unlikely. No, not even close. But people were small. So you'd wear it like that, and then you have the one strap would go over the shoulder to have more support because the sword weighs quite a bit. And what you could do is if you were walking around, you could hook your scabbard ring onto that hook so it keeps it up higher off the ground. If you're on horseback, you would unhook it and so the sword then would hang lower. And that, of course, would cause drag wear on the bottom. This particular sword was made at the Springfield Arsenal. The Springfield Arsenal begins in 1795 and made primarily firearms, some accoutrements, and did, after the Civil War, make a handful of swords. This is one of the swords they made, and it's got the nice, shiny, fancy blade to come up and look at. We have a picture of it on there. There you can see the U.S. and the eagle. This particular one, based upon the mark, Springfield Armory, running horizontal with the blade. This is the last production. They made about 200 of these between about 1900 and 1902. That was the tail end of this because in 1902 they come up with something new for officers. Next slide, please. And there it is, the model 1902 sword for all officers. Prior to this, we've been looking at cavalry sabers for the most part. Prior to this, different branches of service might have had different swords. That meant that if you were a supplier or a retailer, you had to have all this variety out for sale. Are you ever going to sell that artillery sword? Maybe eventually. But then they kind of made it easier, and they said, okay, all officers are going to carry this sword. The first 2 years of production, they used German silver for the scabbards and for the guards. German silver is a soft metal. You can see a pretty serious dent down here in this. That wasn't done to tighten it up like the Civil War ones. That's somebody just got it stuck in a door or whatever on accident. Very soft metal, and it was decided, you know what? these things get damaged too easily. So in 1904 they said, okay, remake, let's change the regulations, let's do a steel scabbard that's nickel plated. And the steel scabbard was much stronger. Now this is not polished up. This nickel silver will polish fairly bright, but not quite be the same color as the chrome when the chrome is polished. This is like a World War II era variety of the sword. They still use this sword today for dress occasions for officers. And the Walla Walla High School Junior ROTC has it backwards. They have their highest ranking person using a replica of the 1860 or light cavalry saber, the enlistment saber. Then all of the cadets of a lower rank are using the officer sabers because it looks like it's something less. So I did tell them that a couple of years ago, and they were like, oh no, you got it backwards. Now also you'll see on these, a number of these, you have the sword knot. The sword knots change through time. This is not very strong. That's not going to hold out in battle, but this is not designed for battle. So in this case, the sword knot is decorative. This one's in leather. Sometimes they are gilded wire. Like you might have one of those, maybe not here tonight. All the enlistment sword knots are leather. The earlier ones are much wider, much stronger. Next slide, please. We're getting through, I promise. Different types of marks on sabers. We've talked about this just a little bit. So here we have a maker's mark. Maker's mark, sometimes they're straight lines. This one did it in a circle. And on the other side of the ricasso, you have the U.S. government ownership marking. Then you have the inspector's initials, and then you have the date. That's kind of the common setup for those. And in this case also, on the pommel itself, there's two different inspectors that looked at the sword and said it was okay. This inspector right here is the one that says the overall sword is fine. Inspectors you see on various parts, whether it be at the drag or the pommel, sometimes they're just saying, I checked out this part and it's fine, so I'm putting my stamp on it. So you can continue to put this together with other pieces, and the government will accept it and pay for it. If the inspector doesn't approve a weapon, the government doesn't pay for it. It goes back to the manufacturer. Sometimes they sell it on the side to some unsuspecting person. Other times they destroy it and have to make up new pieces to fulfill the contract. Next slide, please. So here we go. There's the Christian Roby mark right there. Here's an Emerson in silver from New Jersey. And there's a different example of the Springfield Armory. This is an earlier example where it's perpendicular to the blade as opposed to running the length of the blade. Now this is a piece from the Fort Walla Walla Museum collection. Now, if anybody remembers Helen Corfage, who was very active with us early on as a volunteer, she had told me that she had her grandfather's sword from Fort Walla Walla one day. I go, whoa, I would love to see that. She goes, well, I'll bring it in next week. I think she was part of the Thursday afternoon crew that worked on textiles. So next week she comes in, I can't find it. Maybe my brother has it. I go, well, it's when we've gone. A week later, she brings in the sword. You do not own your weapons if you're enlisted or a non-commissioned officer. Officers buy their own gear. They're paid a lot more. They can afford to buy their own weapons and uniforms. But if you're an enlisted person, you don't own the weapons. They're property of the government. That's that U.S. marking on it. So she said she had his sword from Fort Walla Walla. Well, he wasn't supposed to have it. It was supposed to be turned in. But we know this was his sword. The Ames marking is on a scroll. It's very light. That particular stamp is very light, so it's always kind of hard to read. We do see on this part of the blade, this burnishing is done when they finish the blade. If you clean that blade 10 or more times, that kind of gets polished off. You don't see those little striations there. Now look on the other side, the ricasso, and there's actually scratches. Can you see the scratches going at a slight angle on that slide? They shouldn't be doing that. They should be all going like this. Well, what's missing from this side of the blade? The rest of the stampings. The U.S. government ownership, the United States inspector, and the year it was accepted. So I think Helen's grandfather did use this sword at Fort Walla Walla because he stole it and he ground off the U.S. government ownership. So this is a treasure. So we think this is actually a Fort Walla Walla used saber. Next slide, please. Here's other types of markings that you see. Here's the pommel of a light cavalry saber. You can see all kinds of numbers stamped on top of it to the point where it's dented the brass in. And over here you can see an I and a 10 and other numbers. Well, this is Troop I of the 10th Cavalry, and then associated with different soldiers. In the mid-1880s, it was required that all military enlisted personnel had to mark each piece of equipment with their specific identification. And that would be their regiment, in this case, troop for cavalry. If they were infantry, it would be a company, the letter, and then an individual number. And most cavalry groups went up to 60 or 70 or so soldiers, so you see numbers in that range, sometimes bigger than that. But if it's infantry, it can go up over 100 people. So this was issued and reissued to the 10th Cav. And that happens to be one of the African-American regiments, or what we sometimes call Buffalo Soldiers. And you frequently see their stuff marked. But every piece of equipment, here's an example. This is a piece of leather from the top of the scabbard for their carbine. The scabbard would be tied onto the saddle, and you would put the carbine in that when you were riding, so you wouldn't have to carry it. And it's marked, soldier number 59, Troop M of the 9th Cavalry, another African-American group. So every piece of equipment was supposed to be marked this way. That way, if you lost an item, you couldn't steal your buddy's example and say that you had all your equipment. You were responsible for your equipment if it was thus marked. I figured this out when I used to teach archaeology field school. The second year, I adopted this principle, because the first year, a quarter of the equipment got lost by the students. The next year, everything was numbered. There was kit number 1, kit number 2, 3, 4. Everything had a number on it. And they had to sign off that it was all there, and they had the price. If they wanted to get their grade, if they lost a piece, they had to replace it. So a Marshalltown trowel at that point was $6.49. So if they lost it, they had to replace it. Well, that entire field season, 2 items got lost. And people were responsible for it. So I think the Army was doing a smart thing. Next slide. Now this is a scabbard from that experimental saber we were looking at. It's got soldier number 1 here. Soldier number 1 is probably one of the sergeants. And there could somewhere be records showing you who was assigned what number. So it is possible to potentially identify who used these. And back here you have a big H and a 13. One of the books we have here has another H13. So we know that particular troop had multiple things that were marked. It's a different soldier number on that one. Marking your pieces to be responsible. Next slide. And here's the last way you see markings. This is not a cavalry saber. This one happens to be a medical staff sword. But you can see there's engraving on it. Now you can scratch your own name into a sword. I've seen that plenty of times, just saying this belongs to me. That's not the same as a presentation. Now, this is kind of cool. Presented to Warren Tapley, April 17, 1861, by his friends. Sometimes it'll be the troop will like their officer and will put their money together to buy a sword for the officer. In this case, by the friends. Well, look at that date, April 17, 1861. That's 3 days after Fort Sumter falls. Fort Sumter falls the next day. Congress declares war. The next day, Lincoln calls for 60,000 or 90,000 troops, whatever it was. The next day, the sword is presented to this guy. This guy's in there at the beginning. He does his 90-day service. Lincoln had hoped it was going to be a short endeavor. But after his 90-day service, he said, no, this isn't the life for me, so he kind of left the military, which is probably one of the reasons why the sword's in such good shape. Here's some of the gold wash is worn away where that rubbed against his uniform. But if you look at the rest of the sword, it's got like 99% of the gold wash still on it, and the blade is like new. And got real lucky, found a picture of the guy. First thing I found is a reference in a book. And this same individual was gifted a big 4-pound Colt Dragoon revolver from the governor of Massachusetts. That implies his family was connected. If the governor's given you something, and then later on, this picture showed up on a dealer's website. So we actually know what the guy looks like. next, I think that kind of wraps things up. Oh, no, here's just an example of a surgeon with that sword. Not our same guy, but a different one. Next. And there we go. Some notes on U.S. Cavalry sabers. And final slide is the museum logo. Thank you so much for supporting our